Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar that we have today. Joining us today is only Joshua Castellino. My apologies, I was just checking on the... Yes. Sorry, there seems to be a time lag today, which is even more marked because my computer process is a little bit slow. But yes, joining us today, we only have Joshua because Sarah is unfortunately not well. So she sends her regards, and today we're using this time to talk about issues that are of Joshua's specialty. And we hope that we can touch upon some aspects that perhaps we didn't get a chance to talk about in our previous sessions. So thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us today, and welcome back, because it's been a while since we did the session.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for staying up so late, Chiteshwari, and other listeners, viewers in India and further east. Yeah, and sorry we didn't manage to connect last time. Apparently, even YouTube is fallible at times.
Yes. YouTube is known to give us... Well, it hadn't happened to me before, but apparently it does happen sometimes that some servers are blocked at some points. But luckily, we could get that fixed. So very, very glad that we can get today's session going. And we do have... I mean, we weren't too sure whether we should publicize this because we weren't very sure if Sarah would be on board. So we didn't send out the last-minute reminder with Joshua, just in case, in case we have a little bit of a slow turnout today. But let's keep all that aside and let's talk about something which I think was very heartening news that we saw in the last week since we last chatted, which was that we see a fantastic movement, which is of youth climate action, sped along by a girl who's 16 years old and brought about where a lot of young people are finding very creative ways to protest an issue which seemingly doesn't seem to have a swift resolution, but there's a very large understanding that action is needed. And I wanted to ask you, Joshua, in your experience of major campaigns, what do you see that is unique about this? And what do you hope, when we're witnessing something and at the same time we're also part of this in some manner, what do you hope that might just come out from such positive energy for the first time in what seemed like a long time? Did you lose me? Hello? Sorry.
We're back. So even in the first world, we have these kinds of internet problems, it seems. Right. Yeah, the march. No, I think it was a phenomenal development, a really, really phenomenal development. And I think that in a sense, it reassures me a little bit on a stream of thinking I've had for a while. When you look at the globe at the moment, it's all doom and gloom. It's all demoralization. It's all, oh, it's terrible. We've got people in government who don't understand policy. We are still having to convince people that climate change is real, as if, what will it take really for us to discover that? We've got the country I'm living in now, we have we're essentially the equivalent. I described it, I did an interview recently for a Polish channel, and they asked me about Brexit, and I said, it's the equivalent of everybody standing on a starting line in a 100-meter race, everybody hoping to win. But while the gun has got off, one of the candidates has decided to saw his foot off and see if maybe that'll help give an advantage. And it's a bit of that, failure to understand policy. And in the midst of all of this doom and gloom, we've got this phenomenal movement. My daughter skipped school on Friday, told me in no uncertain terms that she was going to the climate march because it was really important. And I said, are you sure you're not going because you want to miss school? And she said, no, actually, today is one of my favorite days in school, but it is important to go. And it was also quite interesting to hear from her perspective that the large number of people who turned out in the London one were largely girls. It was largely girls and not so much boys. And I wonder what that is saying too about political activism. I was in Poland when that march happened and the main streets were closed. And it was quite amazing. No, I think it's incredible and it's a source of hope, because I do believe that in the attitudes of the younger people that are coming through, they take certain things for granted. They take for granted that the generation above them, in a sense, in age, has essentially not only been part of the ruination of the planet, but actually has no ideas on how to fix it. They take that for granted, and they feel that very strongly. The other interesting thing I found from conversations with that age group, and maybe I'm biased because it's through the eyes of my children, they have a much, much, much better understanding of things like gender identity. There aren't any of those kinds of stigmas and the problems that we have. And I think in many ways it's remarkable, isn't it, that when children are in that environment together, they don't see caste and religion and gender. And this is something that our education systems have not only been unable to counteract, they seem to be injecting this stuff in. And our political milieu seems to be injecting this stuff in. So the contrast between the kind of report you'd get from a 16-year-old child or a 14-year-old child looking at the world is starkly different from the kind of view you get from mainstream political parties, who still feel the need to justify, whether or not climate change is occurring and what steps are being taken, who still need to justify all the world's problems in terms of who is doing what to whom and why. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from there. And again, like you, I don't know what's going to happen with this phenomena. I don't know if schools will survive kids going every Friday away from school to do this. But the reaction also from schools here has been overwhelming. So schools haven't had that kind of draconian approach to people missing classes, for instance. It's a source of hope, and I hope we can build on it. And I hope that we can show, and your bigger question was, what does it say about social movements? I hope what it shows is social movements can also be used for good, because in recent years, they have been hijacked for bad. They have been hijacked by people who want to make aggressive political points. And when they have been, the last big social movement in London, for instance, was the Anonymous movement. And if you remember, this was with the masks. Yes. And again, they were protesting quite important aspects, but immediately the fact that there was a protest meant it attracted all kinds of other unsavory characters. And there is this danger that these unsavory characters see an opportunity, are fully aware of how it can be exploited, and then jump in there and undermine it. Somehow that didn't happen with the climate march, and that's phenomenal. Perhaps there's something, from the eyes of the young. It's hard to then go into that circumstance and hijack it. Maybe we've grown in our humanity in looking at it.
Well, I hope so too. I really hope that is the result of what we see right now, and I hope also that the sort of energy that people have, that young people have brought, doesn't really get mitigated over time, which I think is something that we see as a trend in most social movements. Partly because, of course, you get weighed down by reality, but also because at some point enough people can break up a larger core movement into various factions, and then you see a lot of splitting and smaller groups splitting, because ideologies, of course, stem from a very strong place of conviction, and it's quite easy for you to become quite rigid in that. I think one of the aspects that we've discussed also in this course is that a lot of ideologies need to be, of course, rigid, but we need to have an understanding of the otherness sometimes in people, so that we can move on and make something more concrete out of movements coming up. And I think most of our various legal statutes are a result of that, because they start at some point and they end at some point. And keeping that in mind, Joshua, I thought what we've discussed in the course is also, we've given examples of various minority rights, and we've asked people to actually browse the website of the Minority Groups International and pick issues that are very current and what they find in that. And a lot of people have shared that they've sort of articulated respect, like in terms of people who are in the mainstream, or people who have rights afforded and given to them, seem to have a fundamental lack of respect towards the dignity of people who are indigenous communities and minorities. I know that it's in the legal language, because rights are something, as you and Sarah have very often just like explained, that rights are something which are given, and at the same time they also need to be earned and recognized. Where do we see the parlance of respect? I'm just wondering that, do we need to understand it strictly from a legal perspective? Do we need to understand it as something more? What do we do to make sure that this is, or as you say, do
Are you there?
forms of protection to vulnerable groups?
Okay, I missed some of that because you froze, but I think I got the
Yeah.
So let's set the legal aside, right? Let's just let's use an analogy. Let's assume that I don't want to use example of a car, even though I'm thinking of a car. Let's assume that you have 10 people in a house, and those 10 people are tasked with protecting a forest. And let's assume that the protection of the forest is all important, and we have to somehow make sure we safeguard it, that we essentially make sure it's safe from encroachers, from poachers, from other people who will impact its biodiversity. Let's assume also that in that house of 10 people, there's only one person who actually is not a minority. So we are in a situation where we're doing this constantly in society. We are using about 10% of human capacity to solve the biggest problems. You look at anywhere in the world, you look at the fact, even the climate change debate, right? How many of the people that are around the world that are affected by that are party to that discussion? Not many. How many of the world's people who are experiencing poor political governance are involved in some shape or form in addressing better forms of political governance? How many indigenous peoples who have lived in forests from time immemorial sustainably are actually involved in forest preservation? So what we are actually seeing, just at a pragmatic level, forget about this the rights and everything else. What we're seeing at a pragmatic level is we have been unable as a human civilization to design mechanisms that give us the benefit of our entirety of our population. So many countries in the world, not quite the majority, thankfully, but many countries in the world, still women don't participate can't participate. There's no way to even enable that participation in any meaningful way. So immediately you're now working with only 5 people in that house of 10. Now, in addition, when you factor in that majority populations dominated and elite populations dominated, you're probably down to 2 out of 10. So we're constantly working on this idea that somehow the greatest ideas will somehow be born in Columbia, Harvard, Yale. That's it. If you're slightly more adventurous, you might look at Oxford or Cambridge. If you're even more adventurous, you might look at JNU. But you're not really going to understand the fact that those universities account for less than 0.05% of the educated population in the world. Yet, all of the jobs end up going there. So this is a pragmatic question. If we have a major problem to solve, can we really afford to solve it by using such a small population? I ask this when I do sessions in schools here in London. I say to people in the schools, this 16, 17-year-old boys, I say to them, well, imagine if the English football team was only drawn from people who lived in London. And they said to me, but that's ridiculous. And I said, why? Why not just draw the entire English football team from the people in London? And they said, but then we won't have a chance. And I said, why? This is because talent exists everywhere else. And I said, but that's what we're doing in every walk of life. We are just drawing from a very tiny perspective and a very small proportion of the population. Put it this way, if I have, God forbid, a major disease in 15 years' time and I need some kind of surgery, do I want to know that my doctor is from the best educated elite community? Do I care whether the doctor is female or male? Do I care whether the doctor is, size 8 shoes, size 10 shoes, or no feet at all? Do I care what they do in their bedroom? Do I care what football team they support, or if they don't support a football team? We don't, right? So we are not giving ourselves the chance to benefit from the full extent of human ingenuity. And we're not doing that not because we are preventing Dalits from getting jobs, or not because we're preventing Roma from getting jobs, because we're not investing early enough in giving the kids who are born into these communities a real sense of aspiration about the goals that they should pursue. They're not being encouraged to go into medicine, into engineering, into scientific research. Sure, some of them are getting some kind of training and they're ending up in clerical jobs. Sure, some of them are ending up in transport, but are they ending up running it? I'm not sure they are. So I think at a very pragmatic level, for me, the question of minorities is the same question as it is on gender. It's the same question as it is on indigenous peoples. It's the same question as it is on LGBTQIA. It's the same as it is on disability. Really, is that so important? Somebody's identity is so important that we will somehow, already 25 years before they could be in a position to contribute, we will restrict the extent to which they may contribute? It seems crazy. So for me, that's the pragmatic argument. The legal argument, of course, and the moral argument. Sorry, Chiteshri, I missed you. You were going to come in there?
Thank you. I got your points, but I'm struggling today with the broadcast. I'm just wondering if we should stop and restart our computers. Can you hear me now very clearly?
Very clearly. The problem is just when it freezes, it freezes. But when we can hear you, we hear you very clearly.
I think that yes, use these on human ingenuity with various other groups, and why not we've not used them. If I could get that was the gist of the excerpt that you made. I'm so sorry that I missed parts of it. But Joshua, building further on that, I know that we've had this discussion before, but we've always, because we've used the wonderful theoretical perspective where we know whether some groups are seen as subjects in law versus objects in law. Just in a real scenario today, like if you look at, because you're now in a position where you look at issues like this on a daily basis, and you possibly have a sense to evaluate at least the progress or at least the state that we're in as compared to even a decade ago. Do you think now that minorities and vulnerable groups are actually treated as subjects in law? Do you find that transition has happened? Or do you still see that there's parts and there's regimes where that understanding is really not fully met and realized in the discourse?
It's a great question, Cheteshri. Let me answer it, I guess, partly by giving you an insight into what I was doing last week. I was in Kenya, and in Kenya, there is an indigenous people called the Ogiek. And the Ogiek are a traditional hunter-gathering community. So they've lived in harmony with their environment since time immemorial. They are bee gatherers, one of the few hunter-gatherer communities left in Africa. Okay, they live in a Mau forest, and the Mau forest has been, it's actually, those of you who might know Kenya, the Mau forest will conjure up all kinds of images, including the anti-colonial movement in Kenya. But the long and the short of it is that the Ogiek have been essentially evicted from the Mau forest. They still retain small bits. They retain possession in some small bits, but by and large, they have been evicted. We started a case at Minority Rights Group International 10 years ago. That case was won in the African Court of Human Rights 2 years ago. Very big judgment. And if you want to look at the clip, it's on our website. Huge event for the community, huge event for the Ogiek in Kenya, but a massive event for indigenous peoples across Africa. In fact, there's a question now that you, Chiteshri, might be familiar with on eviction of forest dwellers in India. And we are going to be writing a submission that uses this African Code of Human Rights as a precedent. Anyway, the question of are they subjects or objects of law, which is the gist of your central point to me. We found that, first of all, the implementation of that judgment has stalled. So I had to work really hard to meet a range of different actors to convince them that the implementation has to go ahead, and then to recommend how we do it, to look at ways in which the Mau forest had been better protected under Ogiek occupation than the Kenya Forestry Services, to look at ways and means you could include this. But interestingly, while I was talking to the Ogiek elders, and one of the first things I did when I went to the Mau forest was to meet the elders, sit at their feet in a sense, and hear from them their perspectives, which for them was a unique experience because they were not used to somebody coming to do that to them. But obviously, my culture is a lot closer to their culture than it is to maybe the culture that I'm in now. But interestingly, of course, immediately two things came up. They said to us, you know what? There are very few people from our community who have got a university education. We have no access to education. And then I said, well, what about health? They said, we are really struggling with HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. And I said, but that seems difficult to imagine. The Global Fund works on Kenya and works on the 100% eradication of these diseases. They didn't know about the work of the Global Fund. Last week also, I was in Geneva talking to the Global Fund about this question, saying, how come you want 100% eradication? The Ogiek haven't heard of you. So what I'm trying to say is that when you look at Kenyan attainments on education, on life expectancy, they have grown. When you look at the Ogiek attainments on education, and especially susceptibility to HIV and TB, they have grown too. They have become a bigger problem. So what is happening then is that, yes, the Ogiek are recognized as subjects in law, but the implementation gaps still mean that the promises made from that subjecthood are not being received and enjoyed. So there are blocks in the system. Now, where are the blocks in the system? So look, some of them are practical, right? The Mau forest is huge. It's hard to get health services into the Mau forest. Those are practical problems. Some of them are ideological. The people who are doing the health service have a prejudice towards the Ogiek. So they are less likely to be welcoming to them. Some of them are to do with the fact that they don't necessarily communicate in the same language. Some of them, to be fair, is on the Ogiek side. They feel, well, we don't really want to go to those clinics. I don't think they have any answers. We'll deal with this with traditional medicine. So whichever way you look at it, there's somehow the achievement of the subjecthood hasn't really resulted in a material change in some of the access to the SDGs. And that's the problem we need to work at.
But Joshua, in that context, would you, because you say the implementation or the materialization of the subjecthood has not yet been attained, in the truest sense, we would still say that they're not yet subjects in law, or would you say that this could be something that could be achieved or bridged, like this gap could be bridged if there were more concentrated efforts? Or do you think that because it's something which is so much more larger than just an outreach effort, it's, as you say, it's ideological and there's various, there's like an imbalance looking at both sides. Do you think that, what would be this transition point? Because I think that's very important for us to think, not just in like, this is a fabulous case study, but when we look at a lot of indigenous groups from all over the world, and then we look at where, the paradigms have not yet been adjusted, it seems to be that perhaps we can't just have like a binary position on this. Like, we need to probably think of structures or regimes where their representation becomes very systematically ingrained into the legal structure. And actually, we do have a question where we say that how do we build structures that truly represent indigenous forms of
yeah. So let me tackle, there's a few elements to what you've put out there. First of all, are they subjects or objects? I think you're right in that you can't use a binary. I would say in law they are subjects because they're covered under Kenyan law, no question. And they're recognized in every shape and form as Kenyan indigenous peoples, forest-dwelling peoples, no question on that at all. Okay. The problem is the so what question after that. So what? Well, you're a subject now, big deal. So previously, you see, when we talked about subject and object, previously we had instances where the rights were just overrun. Now we are killing them by not paying enough attention. So that's where we've gone. It's a subtle change. Now there's no attempt to try and dismiss, but there isn't necessarily a proactive attempt to solve. I am an optimist. You will never get me saying it's impossible to change anything. We are there. We are designing projects with the Ogiek. We are trying to get a mobile health unit to go around. We're trying to work on language translation of the materials. We're trying to build awareness. We're doing adult literacy groups with women, OGIEC. We're trying to use the few graduates that are there to give classes. We're trying to get registered teachers into the forest. All of these things are important. And of course, the press and the dissemination of it is important, because we want ordinary Kenyans to understand when they are studying in their textbooks. We don't want them to have a picture of what it means to be a Kenyan as only being a cosmopolitan Kenyan. This is a huge part of Kenyan ideology. It's a huge part of Kenyan identity. Not just that, from an environmental perspective, the Mau forest, if you look it up on a map, and probably Google Maps will do, if you look at the geographical terrain, that houses the water towers. Those water towers feed into Lake Victoria. That Lake Victoria feeds into the Nile, that feeds eventually into the Mediterranean. So there's a huge environmental element here, and there's a huge lack of know-how in terms of how to protect the water towers. And guess what? The OGIEC have known how to do this since time memorial. The Kenyan Forestry Service, by the way, to whom the forest has been handed over, have actually been found 3 months ago. There was a report. They have been found to be responsible for some of the illegal logging taking place. So I think there is a whole mindset. So what I'm trying to describe to you is I guess, is a multifaceted approach. One, get the OGIEC their land back because they can protect the environment better, number one. Two, because that's their homeland that's been taken away. Then worry about the extent to which Kenyan education system and health system pays enough attention. Look, there's nobody in the Kenyan health system and education system that I came across that wants to eliminate the OGIEC, that wants to deprive them of it. So part of this is just the design is not intelligent enough. So let's work on the design. Why is the design flawed? It's because the OGIEC are not at the table. So let's bring the OGIEC to the table. So there are a number of different points here. And I think part of my organization, Minority Rights Group International, part of its goal is really to try and find a way by which we can literally think through the 25, 30 touch points that we need to hit if we're going to get change. And that doesn't mean we'll succeed at all of them. But if we start succeeding in some of them and we get a mindset shift, then other people with even greater imagination, I'm not accusing us of having imagination, but other people who are vested in the problem will bring their skills and their abilities to the table, and that's the goal.
Thank you, Joshua. Actually, that is very worth taking into note, and it's really heartening to note that this is the sort of work that you do. And I think it's also that get to be at both forums where you can interact with them and literally meet them and actually be someone who collects this information, and you can take it to a larger forum where you put it in a context where it's understandable, because I don't think a lot of us can really understand these sort of parallel worlds so easily, and
yeah,
it's really go back on a larger question which we had, and somebody has raised this on the discussion forum about intellectual property rights and regimes that have been afforded which recognize formal intellectual property, because in the chapter that we discuss it, we talk about ways where these laws can be relaxed so that it protects indigenous rights. We received a question and we received a comment saying that why are we only speaking about relaxing intellectual property regimes in the context of indigenous people and vulnerable groups? Why aren't we looking at underdeveloped economies? And I was just wondering if you could share your comments on that.
Yeah, it's an extremely good question, that, and I mean, in a sense, let's just look at why intellectual property rights were put in place and who they protect first, okay? So intellectual property rights essentially are there to protect the inventors. So the idea here somehow is that there are people who are out there, working at various different solutions. They come up with an answer, and they then need to be acknowledged as the holders of that particular answer. Now that's fair and good, okay. The other aspect you need to bear in mind with any research on, for instance, expensive cancer drugs or expensive pharmaceuticals especially, is that it's a process of trial and error. So you invest for a long time, you have many wrong turns and many blind alleys, and finally you end up at the right route. So when you come to the right conclusion, you then need to make sure that you somehow offset the cost of all the blind alleys you've been through. That's the rationale. So the rationale has been protect the investors, and that will help protect the inventors rather, and that will help to ensure that they can keep promoting, they can keep innovating, they can keep coming up with solutions. The difficulty with that, of course, is that it does privilege big business, very much so. It does very much give the onus of the right to keep developing those to large pharmaceutical companies and large operations who have the wherewithal to do it. Now, patent law is set up in such a way that various people can apply for patents. So the problem isn't an access to patent question. There might be something there, but it's not a large issue there. And the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is headquartered in Switzerland, WIPO.org is the website if you want to look it up, is relatively open with how these things can work. The difficulty is that there are questions where there is an urgent need for a community that's set in an impoverished setting, where we have a solution, but somehow the solution is too expensive to apply. The situation I'm describing is probably the most famous case of this is the HIV retrovirals example in South Africa, where we have the wherewithal for antiretrovirals, but that has been produced by a specific drug company, and as a result of which, it's subject to huge tariffs. So the result is that even though, and there was an Indian company, I remember in 2003 interviewing the CEO of this company in Gujarat at the time. There was an Indian company that was producing what's called a generic drug. So the same drug without the investment in intellectual property, and they could do it for something like 1/500th of the cost. So you have this ridiculous situation. So if you are trying to provide HIV retrovirals to communities that are affected, why should you pay the intellectual property add-on? Why should you pay that value add-on? Surely lives are more expensive. And this is the argument that keeps coming up all the time. And I think justifiably keeps coming up. So in that particular case, it was negotiated in such a way that South African government, who decided, who recognized the right to health, the South African government, when they recognized the right to health and promised through their health system to provide retrovirals, would be able to buy the generic drug. And that was a compromise that was struck. And I think, in a sense, that the question that's being raised by our questioner is very much in that line, and I would support that argument 100%. Okay, and I think, in a sense, it's a tough argument to put to corporations. It's a tough argument to put to individuals. But there should be some areas that are sacrosanct. Absolutely, we want people to generate innovative ideas to the big health problems we have, but they don't have a right to aggrandize and make a lot of money out of them for time immemorial either. So there should be some relaxation of the regime when it comes to that. Now, maybe that's different for, I don't know, driving a faster car. Maybe that's different for a faster spec of computer. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm limited in my imagination. But certainly when it comes from health, when it comes to issues of health, and when it comes to the issues of impoverishment in access to some of these fruits of development, they should flow more equally. No question in my mind.
I agree. Thank you, Joshua. I think that's also that's the cases that we've heard about the ART treatments is, I think, the remarkable stance where you really see the role government still plays in this entire gamut which we have of multi-stakeholders and several roles, and that's where I think you see the true power of a government, because you notice that if a government really cares and makes sure that they do have the power to completely change the regime and make sure that they can afford these basic healthcare to their citizens, even if it comes at a price. So that's where I think the role of government is very, very important, where you see a transition from just there being a ruling government to true governance in the sense of what befits and is important for citizens. And we don't seem to see that regularly, but there are remarkable instances that we do. And I think healthcare was one of the places where we saw it.
Wouldn't it be amazing if that South African example had been replicated by other countries that have been facing the same issue? But the fact is that in many countries, there still is this idea that provision of health is not necessarily a right. Provision of these kinds of services is not a right. So if we had seen that example take on, we would have probably won a major set of victories against the patent regimes. But that didn't happen. It was a one-off negotiation.
That's true, and I think it also ties back into the original question that we'd asked to a lot of people, where we looked at economic, social, and cultural rights versus that of social and political rights, and those two conventions, where still you see a very strong argument that you need life first, you need basic services first, you need food, clothing, water, shelter, electricity first. But it's always quite interesting to see who are at the polar ends of that argument. I think we've seen that over time, that it's much more easy to provide something where it's not a tangible service that is befitted to someone, and somebody is transitioning that. I hope you can hear me, Joshua. I hope you've not lost me.
I can hear you perfectly well. Let me, if you don't mind, I'd like to share an insight with you on this, in reflecting. Minority Rights Group is going to be 50 years old this next few months. We were set up 50 years ago by somebody named David Astor, who was the editor of the Observer newspaper, which is a very progressive newspaper here in Britain, even today, to date. And essentially, he was concerned about the fact that what kept coming across his desk were these stories of ethnic linguistic minorities facing ethnic cleansing, facing these kinds of difficulties. Of course, 1969, that was the time of the Biafran War, and some of you who know your history might appreciate that that was a major, major standpoint in African history. But let me reflect on this social, cultural, and economic and political. So the strategy that the organization followed, quite rightly, was we don't speak for minorities, indigenous peoples. We are not the state, we're not the spokespeople for minorities, indigenous people. So we saw our role as emphasizing the extent to which minorities and indigenous peoples were invited around the table to participate in discussion. So our great focus was political participation. And for that, we did things like we tried to open doors for them, we tried to get them invited, tried to get fundraising to go to get them invited, tried to build capacity, tried to teach them the language, tried to train them, tried to mentor them, all of those things. And that's 50 years of activity. But basically, we've begun to ask ourselves that question now as to whether that was the right approach. And the reason is simple. Even if you get minorities and indigenous peoples around the table, very often they don't and can't speak as minorities and indigenous peoples. Take the example of women. Women on quotas, very often when they get to parliament, they have to follow the mainstream. Or they have to raise, they're only allowed to raise women's issues, not everything else. So political participation has its limitations itself. And then further, in many cases, we have not succeeded in getting political participation. We haven't succeeded in getting communities around the table. So we haven't been able to worry about their education rights and their health rights. And you end up in this lose-lose game. So now we think much more that actually this is political participation is crucial because we don't want to speak for minorities. We don't feel we can. But we have to also start working on educational rights, health rights, climate change impacts, all of those. So it's an insight into, I think before I took this role, I would be advocating for economic, social, and cultural rights at all times because I think, in a sense, the whole milieu of deprivation of rights, for me, starts off from that poverty, the poverty trap. Goal one, marquee goal, Jeff Sachs calls it. Absolutely. If you don't solve that, you can't. It's difficult for you to solve everything else. And I think the insight I have had from 6 months in this particular role is you still got to go back to a multi-storied impact and a multi-storied attempt to try and solve the problem.
That's a remarkable insight coming from you, Joshua, that you're looking at the past 6 months in this role and thinking about your stance in that context. I think it's very valuable that you find yourself evaluating and continuously reevaluating that thought process. And I think that it's quite. I just wonder how people in roles of larger leadership also think about that once, especially people I think who've been on the other side or probably have been leaders in civil society, leaders in business, and then you actually get the power through leadership, which is political, like so to speak, like actual rule making, legislative making, law making powers, and then you see the challenge that is posed when you're actually sitting at that table. And I think it's worthy that we do need to think about that. My final question to you, Joshua, today, so that we look at this larger discussion on minorities, vulnerable groups, indigenous people, and the regimes that govern them. You mentioned 50 years of Minority Rights International and coming soon. if we're looking at 50 more years ahead, because it's quite a popular trend now that we want to look 50 years, 100 years ahead. If we're just looking 50 more years ahead, would you firstly see a scenario where more indigenous groups or people who really grow up and speak a different language from us, as you say, because language is a very, very crucial aspect to that, would you really see them at the table? Or would, translating their speech into a language that we understand? Or do you think it would be better if we truly understand those languages? What I'm asking in the context is that, of course, the world is becoming more homogenized and we're understanding a universal rights regime. But at the same time, do we need to think about the fact that maybe the reason why it's not been so universal is because we've not understood that some things are very, very relative, and we need to probably change our language in the process so that it becomes more inclusive? It's back to the universal versus cultural relativism, but I'm just wondering, do you see that happening 50 years from now, or do you see more homogeneity in this regime?
I mean, this is the question of what will climate change look like on business as usual. So let's start with that. I think business as usual will see an even greater. When I explained to you about the 10 people in a house and the need to protect the forest, and I left you with the fact that there were only 2 we were relying on. When you throw the dominance of Anglophonism, you have, essentially you only have one person left in the room who's going to solve the problem, and that person is often, the white male who's going to solve all the ills of every part of the world, and obviously going to get it wrong as a consequence, because there's no way they can represent so many interests. So I think that's the scenario we risk as business as usual. I think the intervention that we are trying to work on, and the intervention that we would like you to work on as our listeners and viewers, is to make sure that that scenario is not going to be feasible. If there's one thing we should learn from the events of Friday and the climate march, it's that the next generation don't place such a store on that sense of universalism. This started off in Sweden. This wasn't in one of the great centers of power that's always on TV. This was a girl in Stockholm. And I think that, okay, you might say it's still Stockholm and not Sudan, not Khartoum. But actually, in a way, I think in a way, young people have found a better way of connecting with each other. And we should step back and not interfere unduly in that particular conversation. We need to understand more languages. We need to understand linguistic diversity, both in the sense of language and in sense of meaning. We are constantly imposing our meanings on other people. We're constantly reinterpreting it. Even in the way in which Anglophone countries dominate, it's particular Anglophone countries that dominate. So I think this is a major challenge. And my prediction, for what it's worth, right? But my prediction, for what it's worth, is that we are getting to such an impasse in terms of the challenges we face that we have no option but to be inclusive. I think actually it's the necessity is going to drive us to be inclusive, and that in that necessity, we are going to be aware of the need to go to 3, 4, 5, 20, 30, 50 different languages. So I think in a sense, necessity will dictate that we go to indigenous people to understand how to protect the forest. I really believe that if we listen carefully enough to that necessity, we will find that the only answer possible is inclusion. We've already discovered that answer with gender. We've already discovered it. We've not implemented it, but we've already discovered that answer with gender. We've already realized that actually, you know what, you can't have a boardroom that's all male. You can't have a government that's all male. You can't even have a police force or a military that's all male. Preserves that were assumed. Now, we may have realized that. We haven't implemented it yet, but the realization has come, right? I think the same realization will come. I have incredible faith in human ingenuity, and I have incredible faith in human ingenuity when faced with necessity. We are increasingly getting to a point where necessity is crucial. On climate change, indigenous peoples are the best custodians of the climate, without a doubt. The slash and burn farming that they do, that is often pilloried, doesn't compare at all with the massive logging companies and the massive exploitation by multinationals that's taken place. So beware of the promotion, beware of the narrative to try and discard and discount these people. They have answers, we need them, and we have to speak their language to understand it. Yes, we hope that they will also meet us some way, but believe me, they have done more than meet us that way. They've seen their lands taken away, they've seen picket fences drawn into them, they've seen entire forests uprooted. We have to show that we want to learn from them. We need to go to them. We need to sit at their feet. We need to study their systems, and we need to engage them in the solutions we have. Not just take it, go away, back to a laboratory in Harvard and recreate it. We need them to be part of the solution.
That's wonderfully said, Joshua, and I really hope that that's something that we see, and I hope that in this context where there is, who knows, maybe 5 years, 10 years down the line, we would be able to speak to each other also in a language where we don't even use the word we, they, and we just say that X tribe is also represented at X point, and this is what they say. So it's a total, as you said, a complete understanding of just rewriting of how the language that we use, and then also the meaning in that language also ought to be different. And I hope that we get there.
We have to be the change we want to see.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joshua, and looking forward to having you on the next session. And I hope that Sarah can also join, because we really have had a wonderful response to the gender profiles exercise this time. And so we really I hope that we can discuss that in the next session. And thank you to everybody who's joined us and sent us their questions through the discussion forum and through today. Good night, everybody. And